Hello everyone. So today we're going to be doing something really interesting. We are going to set up MAAS in a high availability cluster. We're going to take two servers. We're going to make them failover. They have a post-GRE SQL database. They're going to share one. There's going to be recovery modes. We're going to have a virtual IP interface. We're going to use HA proxy to load balance the two. I've tested it. It's a pretty sturdy environment. It works pretty well. I've created some scripts to make life a little easier that I will share with all of you. We have a lot of work to do to get this done. I'm going to try to make this video as fast as possible, but it's going to be a long process. It's pretty interesting, well worth it. You can do this to as many nodes as you'd like. We're just going to do 2 in this test. There's a little bit of information out here. If you just search MAAS HA, it will take you to this MAAS page and kind of give you a rundown of what you have to do to get it to HA, but it's not quite all the steps that you need to do, but still useful. There's also some post-GRE SQL advice all over the place on how to get it set up for the write-ahead logs to do this recovery hot standby setup. I'll put all this stuff out on the website when we're done. But first thing we need to do, well, before we do that, let's take a look. So I just want to show you quickly, I have reinstalled, I want to mention that this is 16.04 on both these servers, so we are moving ahead to the next version. This is the most current version. I installed 16.04 on 2 separate physical servers, and all I did was update and upgrade both of them. You can see the upgrades are completed, and I did configure. Let's take a look at history and make sure I didn't do anything else. I did configure the network interfaces. So let's take a look at that real quick. I will give you the displays of what's in my network interface files. I'm going to make one quick update to these. So the rack server, so the region controller is what we are getting ready to configure into HA. The rack controller is actually what handles the nodes underneath it, and that's what we'll use this 10.1.1.100 to deploy in Pixie Boot and DHCP. From what I've read, rack controllers can be configured in HA through the GUI. So we're going to do that after we get the region controllers up and going. But I'm going to put the DNS, I'm going to go ahead and put a DNS name server entry in specifically for each server. So this one will be 100. Let's save that. And go over this other one. And I've got this one setting at 151 for public and 101 for private. I'm going to go ahead and let it be its own DSN name server as well. We might have to play around with this a little bit after the fact, but I think this will be good. If the rack controller setup works how they say it does, we should be okay. We'll probably have to reboot these nodes later anyway, so we won't bother rebooting them for now. So that's all we've got. You can see the history commands. I've just set up network and done some upgrades. First thing you want to do, now if you read this guide, it's going to tell you to do some different things, but I didn't have any luck with some of them, so I'm just going to show you what I did. I am going to install the MAAS region controller on both nodes. It takes some time, but go ahead and start with that. Okay, the MAAS region controllers are the install's just finishing up. One's done, the other one's almost done. If you take a look at those IPs, pretty much what you expect to see. This is MAAS 2.0, so it's a little different than my other videos. We're going to go ahead and create the admin on MAAS 1. And then we should be able to log in. You can do this quick tutorial type setup thing. It's not super. Hit save down here. It's not super useful. Hit continue. This takes a minute. And then you can go ahead and upload a key. Pull up my documentation. So this is just on the first server. Create a key. Then just display it and import it through that. Import. That works. Go to dashboard. Okay. It's going to do this auto discovery thing. MAAS 2.0 does things a little differently. That really doesn't matter to us much. So we have we actually have two region controllers. Let's take a look at this other one. Okay, it's done. So if you go to the second IP, you will notice we have two separate region controllers. Okay, so the reason why I installed region controller on both, we really only need one. We only want one. But I want all the attributes on both servers. So we're not actually going to use the database that was created over here. We're just going to use the services. So what we'll end up doing is pulling the database, all the database entries from MAAS 1 over to MAAS 2 so that we're pointing at the same database. But then by installing that MAAS region controller, we already have all the stuff in place that we need to be able to fail over successfully. So you don't need to set anything up on the second one via the GUI. We just needed to do it on the first one. And you notice if you go to controllers, we only have one right now. Okay? Let's go back to the doc. This in the extra, so it's kind of giving you a hint that, hey, you need to fix the database stuff before we're going to be able to create that second region controller for you. So this is actually the hard part, is setting up the post-GRESQL HA. This Google Doc walkthrough that has you doing it in AWS is about the best that I've seen, really. They have you creating a table and all that stuff to prove that it worked and the replication's working, but you really don't need to do that, so we're just going to walk through this quick. We need to set up a replication user ID that will be used to pass that database data back and forth to these servers. Pick a password, whatever you want it to be. Do it on both servers, because you'll have to recover from one to the other, so they will both need the ability to talk back and forth. It explains all that user ID stuff in there if you're interested. We need to create an archive directory. This is a little misleading because this really isn't the right link. So I'm going to copy this, but then I'm going to make some changes. Again, we have to do this on both servers if we want to be able to fail over. There's always a version number in here, and that's what is wrong with that tutorial. So you actually need a version number. We're on 9.5, and you'll see this a lot as we go through this. But so create this archive directory. You have to be sudo. Okay, and again, we'll do it on the other server. We're good there. Now, we need to edit the PGHBA config file, because that's what allows each server to talk to each other. And you have to follow me on this one, but it'll make sense later. Let's see. And again, we're on version 9.5. The tutorial is using version 9.3. We're just going to switch over to that. So in here, you need to add the servers that are allowed to connect to it. So, and what user ID they use. And it gives you example here, so you can grab this if you want. Paste it in here. So we need to allow server 2 to connect here with this replication user. So put the server 2 IP in here. And let's blow this up so we can see it all at once here. So that looks good. Save that. And we're going to do the same thing on server 2, only we're going to put the opposite IP in there. And the copy and paste got messed up. Okay. This is kind of your security file, what can connect. I've had some problems with connections. Hopefully I've got them all ironed out before I started this tutorial, but we'll work through it if something happens. And the other server will go on this one. So now that replication can go back and forth with that user ID. So that's good. Next, we need to edit the database config file. And there's a couple things that we need in both files. So let's start on one. Okay, first thing we need is to configure the write ahead log. This is what allows the recovery portion, so it remembers records so that it's going to be pretty close to where you left off. But for a server like MAAS, where things don't change, real rapidly, this is a good thing. It'll work just fine. So you want to change wall level, uncomment that to hot standby, and that's the kind of failover scenario that we're actually getting ready to do. When you do hot standby, you can select what kind of how is it going to keep track of the logs? How's it going to keep track of the records, right? So we're going to do archive mode. So turn uncomment archive mode and turn it on, and then you need to tell it what locations that you would like to archive to, and that's that directory that we just created. So let's we can actually go to the other server here and grab that location that we created. Hopefully that's working like I wanted it to. Let me make sure. We'll go back out to the tutorial. It gives you a good, so that you can use this archive command. We'll have to change the locations, so that can go in there. I can't get this is supposed to be, there's a main directory that it's going to assume that you're using, but I can't get it to work, so I put the whole qualified name in there. So we'll copy that, take it back over. Then we'll do the same thing down here. And that will allow it to archive the log and keep track of the log in that folder. So now we scroll on through. You need to set max wall senders. The tutorial says 3 for testing and purposes. 3 will probably be just fine. And we need to set hot standby to on both nodes. This will allow it to fail over to each other if need be. So if you ever need to fail to one to the other, you want hot standby on both files. So we should be good here. Let's save that. And we're going to do the same thing for the opposite server. I want to check that make dir command. I want to make sure this actually worked. Yeah, okay, we're good. I am going to do the same thing over here, though. Okay, so we're going to edit the config file on the secondary server exactly like we did on the primary. So wall level to hot standby. Go down to archive and turn it on. Remember to uncomment these. Then put your archive command in here. Again, we'll use this. And then change them. Then one here. So that's good. And then max wall senders. Change that to 3. And then hot standby. We need to turn that on. Okay. See if there's anything I missed. So we can restart the primary. And let's make sure it's running. It is. A good indication it is running is if you go back to your GUI and click around a little bit. It won't take long for it to die if that database didn't come up successfully. So now we're going to call the first one the primary, and then we're going to call this one the secondary for now. But they can flop back and forth, and we'll do all that testing, and I'll show you what all that does. But as far as this is concerned, we're going to call this the standby. So we're going to stop the service over here on the standby. So we're going to go into root mode because there's a couple of commands that we have to enter. So we're going to move the existing database. Remember I told you we have 2 completely different instances. We're going to move that one that we created with the install to this old file. So that'll empty this out, and this will allow us to empty it out and copy the database from the primary over here because we only want one database. And this is the post GRESQL backup command. It's a utility that comes with it. This will pull the files from the primary over to the secondary into this directory that we need. So change that to 9.5 and then put in your primary. This is why we had to set up that HB file for access. Okay, hit enter. We have a $sign at the beginning. Okay, if connection is refused, then that means that the database is not listening. And I forgot that parameter in the config file. So let's go back to the config file. And it's almost the first parm. We're going to allow this to listen on any IP on this server. Since we only have one, it's not a huge security risk, but again, your installation might vary. So after you make changes like that, you need to restart PostSQL. While we're at it, we're going to configure this one the same because we will eventually need that back and forth. So put an asterisk in here. Save that, and then it's already stopped, so that change will come up shortly. Alright, let's make sure it's started. I think we're probably good. Now let's try that backup command again. There we go. Now we're connected. And use the password that you created. And now we're pulling in the database from the first node to the second node so that we can become consistent. Okay. So, and this is just telling you that you need to kick that hot standby on, but we've already kicked it on both sides so that we can recover back and forth. Now, the recovery node is always going to have a recovery.conf file. Once it gets recovered to, it will turn into a recovery.done file. I'll show you when we test how that works, but you can't have recovery.conf on both sides because that signifies to the database that it's the recovery node. So there's a default recovery file available on the server at all times. We're going to copy that and edit it for our needs. I have a script that I'll show you that does all this stuff, but for now I want to do it by hand so that I can show you how to do it. Okay. And then we're going to edit that file. And there's really only a couple things we have to change in here. So you have to be in recovery mode. Let's see. Standby. Standby mode needs to be on in your recovery file. And since you're only allowed one recovery, you're only allowed to have the recovery files on the node that's not active. So primary connection, you need to point that at your primary server. So take this. And use the replication user password and the IP of that node. Again, when you recover to this node, this file disappears. And the trigger file. The trigger file is very important. So we're going to go over that. We'll create all that stuff. But you need, and again, it's in this tutorial, you need a trigger file. So when the trigger file is present, and I'm going to make this directory structure. Okay, when the trigger file is present, that means it will promote this database to primary. If you failed over and didn't trigger the promote, you would be in a read-only state all the time. you won't become the master database. And MAAS won't be able to run because it can't do inserts and selects and things like that. So you have the trigger file is the easiest way to get the automatic promotion that we want in this kind of scenario. So change that. I think we're done here. Let's save it. Trigger file. We can start the standby. Okay, this is just testing replication. This log is a really good log to look in if you need to see stuff about the database. Yeah, this is stuff from when it actually came up. It's not going to have anything in there on the secondary because it doesn't own the database. So just quit out of that. We'll get out of root. Now, if you go back, you're not going to see the new controller yet. So the databases are now, it's pointed, both servers are pointed at the same database. The database is living on one. So now what we need to do is take care of actually making that second region controller point at the database. So we're going to stop the region controller on the second node. We're going to delete its identification so we can use the identification from the main database. So this is the MAAS ID and it's secret because they both have unique ones when we installed them. We do not need to actually region.conf. It's a pretty simple file, but it's actually probably just easier to copy and paste this because the permissions are so high on it. You have to go in here and chmod it anyway, so just pop it open. There's only a couple things to change in it anyway. Really all you need is the password to change. So make sure the password that is on 1 is now been updated on 2. I'm going to change this to 155 because in the next step what we're going to do is create a virtual IP interface and I'm going to make it 155. So while we're in here I'm going to go ahead and make this change. Notice this database host is localhost. We want the database host to be the primary host, and there's a command that in the tutorial I want to show you what running that command does because I use it in my script later. So we're going to save that. Let's go back to the primary. We're going to make this also that virtual interface of 155 while we're in here. It can stay localhost because we use it as the primary for now. Now, go back to the tutorial. We want to make sure that that region file has the right permissions. And well, that was owner. We want to make sure it has the right permissions as well. This command changes that primary IP, the one in that region file.conf that we just created. So you want to put your primary SQL server in here. Again, I run this command in my failover scripting, so I wanted to show you what that actually does. It's just changing the field in that text file. So now it's pointed at the primary, and we can restart the region. Okay, so at this point, if you go over to your first MAAS server and hit refresh, we should have two controllers. Let's see what happened. Okay, so we checked syslog on the secondary node, and there's no entry for 151 found in that hba.conf file, the permissions file. So it can't find the database. Let's add the 151 in here just for good measure. Because by default it accesses it on localhost. And it might not like it's saying 151, even though it should know it's as itself, but it might not like that. So we need to restart database. And we'll restart the region controller again. Let's take another look at syslog. Much better. Don't have these ugly errors. So now let's go to the GUI. Still don't have something right. A lot of these errors that you see are because there's no rat controller underneath it. It complains that there's no rat controller. So we still don't have 151. It still doesn't like that. So let's try this. We're going to allow 151 for everything. These issues are almost always permission related. Let's restart database. Restart the region controller. Take a look at the log. Still the same. Let's allow all over here and see if that fixes the issue. Okay. Let's restart the database. We'll come back over here, restart the database, and restart the region controller. And that looks like it allowed the connection to be made. So that's good. Uh, Again, it's a permissions thing. So it was trying to use the MAAS user ID to connect over to there, and we only allowed the replication ID. So we could go back and add the MAAS user ID in those files, but for now, this is what our configuration looks like. And now you can see the second region controller has been added.